A carriage lurched to a stop as two palace guards stepped forward and crossed their staffs before the iron gate. The young woman climbed down at once, holding a leather case filled with the final wedding arrangements she had spent weeks preparing for the Duke's grand ceremony. Before she could speak, one guard shook his head and refused her entry. She reminded them that every flower, every guest table, every piece of music inside that estate had passed through her hands. She had been welcomed through those gates so many times that the servants knew her by name. Yet on the very morning of the wedding, she stood there being treated like a complete stranger. Inside the estate, the chapel bells began to ring. She looked beyond the iron gate, searching for the friend she believed must have sent for her. No one came. The guards simply ordered the carriage to leave before the ceremony began. What she did not know was that the bride walking toward the altar was the very friend she had trusted above everyone else, and the groom waiting inside was the Duke, whose quiet kindness had slowly changed everything, without either of them ever daring to speak of it. Tell me honestly, if you had spent weeks helping prepare the happiest day of your closest friend, only to be turned away at the gate without a single explanation, would you leave quietly or demand the truth? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us which beautiful part of the world you are watching from. Subscribe now. Let's move on. The leather case was still in Sofia Bowe's hands when the second guard stepped closer and told her, without any softness in his voice, that her name was not on the entry list for the morning ceremony. She stood very still. This was the same gate she had passed through 14 times in the last 2 months. She had walked through it, carrying fabric swatches, seating arrangements, correspondence from the florist in Mayfair, and once, a very delicate chandelier piece wrapped in linen that she had been terrified to drop. The older guard on the left, a broad man named Croft, had even held the gate open for her on a rainy Tuesday and told her to mind the puddle near the stone step. Croft was not at the gate this morning. These two were younger, stiff-shouldered, and completely unmoved by anything she said. The taller one kept his eyes forward. The shorter one had already turned away and was speaking quietly to a footman who had appeared from the side path carrying a stack of folded programs. Sofia recognized those programs. She had written the order of service herself, sitting at her small writing desk 3 nights ago by candlelight, checking the spelling of every name twice. She asked again, this time more firmly, to be allowed inside. The taller guard told her the estate was closed to all non-family guests until after the ceremony. He said it the way people say things they have been instructed to say, without thought and without apology. Sofia looked past his shoulder toward the main house. The windows of the east wing were bright with morning light. She could see movement inside, the shapes of people crossing from room to room, the unmistakable blur of activity that only happened on a day like this. Somewhere deep inside that house, a woman was being dressed for her wedding. Somewhere inside, maids were pressing gowns and fastening pearl buttons and arranging hair with trembling, careful fingers. The chapel bells rang once, low and full, rolling across the courtyard and out through the gate. Sofia felt the sound move through her chest. She had chosen those bells. The Duke's steward, Mr. Aldous Fitch, had initially wanted the smaller chapel on the west side of the estate, used for the ceremony, because it was easier to heat in the mornings. Sofia had argued for the main chapel specifically because of its bells. She had stood in that courtyard on a cold afternoon in February and listened to them ring on the hour, and told Mr. Fitch that no bride deserves anything less than that sound on her wedding morning. Mr. Fitch had agreed, eventually, and written it into the final plan. Now the bells were ringing, and Sofia was standing outside the gate, holding a leather case full of documents nobody had asked her to bring. She set the case down on the stone step and pressed her fingers together to stop them from shaking. Around her, the street was beginning to fill. Carriages were arriving from all directions, carrying guests in their finest clothes. She watched a woman in an ivory gown step down from a lacquered carriage and walk straight through the gate without a single word exchanged with the guards. Behind her came an older gentleman with a silver-topped cane, then two young women who were laughing about something, then a family of 5 who moved through the entrance like they owned it. Nobody stopped any of them. Sofia picked up her case and tried once more. She told the guards she had been personally engaged by the Duke's household to coordinate the wedding arrangements. She told them her name was known to Mr. Fitch, to Mrs. Garland, the housekeeper, and to at least 4 members of the senior staff. She told them that the leather case in her hand contained the final copy of the ceremony program, the revised floral placement notes, and a written confirmation of the string quartet's positioning in the chapel gallery, all of which had been requested by Mr. Fitch only 4 days ago. The shorter guard took a small step forward and told her, quietly but clearly, that he had his orders. That was the entirety of his answer. Sofia looked at the gate. She looked at the house beyond it. She thought about Lady Victoria Ashford, her closest friend since the age of 14, who had sent her a note just 2 weeks ago, written in that familiar looping handwriting, saying that she was so grateful, that no one in the world understood elegance the way Sofia did, that this wedding was going to be perfect, because Sofia had touched every part of it. Not one word about being the bride, not one word about Duke Henry Blackwood. Sofia had spent 2 months inside that estate planning a wedding, and had never once been told whose wedding it was. She had been engaged through a solicitor's letter, paid a professional fee, and given access to every room except the private quarters. She had assumed, the way anyone would assume, that the bride was someone she did not know, a distant relation of the Duke, perhaps, someone from the north, someone quiet and well-connected, who had no need to involve herself in the planning details. It had never crossed her mind, not even once. A second carriage rolled past her and through the gate, and Sofia caught a brief glimpse through its window of Lady Josephine Pembroke, whom she recognized immediately from 3 seasons of London gatherings. Lady Josephine was adjusting her gloves and speaking to the older woman beside her, and she did not look toward the gate at all. Sofia stepped back from the entrance. The footman who had been holding the programs had disappeared. The 2 guards had returned to their positions. The street behind her was full of arriving guests and moving carriages, and the ordinary noise of a grand morning, and not one person was looking at her. She stood there with her leather case and the chapel bells fading into silence, and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that she had been deliberately kept outside. Sofia did not leave. She moved away from the gate and walked along the outer wall of the estate until she reached the narrow lane that ran behind the kitchen garden. She had used this lane before, on a morning when the main entrance was blocked by a delivery of chairs from the furniture house in Piccadilly. Mrs. Garland had shown her the side entrance then, a low wooden door set into the stone wall, latched but never locked before noon, because the kitchen staff used it constantly for deliveries. The door was locked. Someone had thought of everything. She stood in the lane with her back against the wall and stared at the door and went through every name she knew inside that house. Mr. Fitch would not help her. She was certain of that. He was a man who followed the structure of things with great devotion and would not deviate from an instruction given by the Duke's household on the morning of the ceremony. Mrs. Garland was warmer, but equally loyal to the house. The head florist, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Dalloway, had no authority over entry. The string quartet had arrived yesterday and would be inside the chapel already. There was no one to send for. Sofia opened her leather case and took out the letter she had received 3 days ago, the one that had brought her here this morning. It was written on the Duke's household stationery, the heavy cream paper with the Blackwood crest pressed into the top corner. It was signed by Mr. Fitch, and it asked her to bring the final documentation to the estate, no later than 8 o'clock on the morning of the ceremony for a last review before the guests arrived. She arrived at 10 minutes to 8. She turned the letter over in her hands and read it again, slowly, looking for something she might have missed. The wording was formal and clear. There was nothing in it that suggested she would be turned away. There was nothing in it that felt like a warning. But someone had removed her name from the entry list. Someone had locked the kitchen door. Someone had made sure that on the morning of this wedding, Sofia Bowe would be standing in a lane behind a stone wall with a leather case and no way inside. She put the letter back and closed the case. Down the lane, a young kitchen maid appeared, carrying an empty basket, walking quickly with her head down. Sofia recognized her. Her name was Nell, and she had brought Sofia tea twice during long working afternoons in the estate's planning room. She was perhaps 16, small and quick, with a habit of tucking her hair behind both ears at once when she was nervous. Sofia called her name softly. Nell stopped. She looked up, and her expression shifted. Sofia asked her what was happening inside. Nell looked back toward the kitchen door. She looked at Sofia. She pulled her hair behind both ears. She said the ceremony was beginning shortly, that everyone was in position, and that she was not supposed to be speaking to anyone outside the estate this morning. Sofia asked her directly who the bride was. Nell's mouth opened and then closed. She shifted the basket from one arm to the other. She looked at the ground. Sofia said the name quietly. Lady Victoria Ashford. Nell said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence and the way she immediately looked away was the only confirmation Sofia needed. The lane felt very narrow suddenly. The stone wall on either side of her seemed closer than it had been a moment ago. Sofia kept her breathing even and her face still, because Nell was watching her from the corner of one eye, and she would not let a 16-year-old kitchen maid see her fall apart in a service lane on a Wednesday morning. She thanked Nell and told her to go about her work. Nell hesitated. Then she said, very quietly, that she was sorry. She said it the way young people say things they have been told not to say, but cannot help saying anyway. Then she turned and walked quickly back toward the kitchen entrance and did not look back. Sofia stood alone in the lane. Victoria Ashford had been her closest friend for 11 years. They had grown up in neighboring houses in Bath before Victoria's family moved to London. They had shared books, confidences, and every significant event of their young lives. When Sofia's mother died 4 years ago, Victoria had sat with her every day for a week without being asked. When Victoria had been publicly embarrassed at the Harlington Ball 2 seasons ago by a remark made by Lord Fenwick's eldest son, Sofia had crossed the room and stood beside her and said something sharp enough to end the conversation entirely. They had told each other everything, or Sofia had believed they did. She thought about the last time she had seen Victoria, 10 days ago at a small afternoon gathering at Lady Georgiana's house in Belgravia. Victoria had been bright and a little distracted, and had laughed more than usual. Sofia had assumed she was simply in good spirits. She had not asked why. She had not pressed. She had been so consumed by the wedding preparations that she had not once thought to ask her oldest friend how she was feeling, or what she was thinking, or whether there was anything significant happening in her life. Victoria had sat across from her and drunk her tea and said nothing. Duke Henry Blackwood. Sofia had met him 4 times during the course of the planning. The first time was a brief introduction in the corridor outside the planning room, arranged by Mr. Fitch, lasting perhaps 3 minutes. The Duke had shaken her hand and said he was grateful for her work and that he trusted the arrangements to her judgment entirely. He had said it without any of the distant formality she had expected from a man of his position. He had said it like he meant it, looking directly at her, and then Mr. Fitch had moved him along to the next appointment. The second time was in the garden, by accident. Sofia had been measuring the distance between the ceremony arch and the first row of guest chairs, when the Duke had come through the garden gate alone, without his steward, apparently walking for no particular reason. He had stopped when he saw her kneeling on the grass with a measuring tape and had asked, without any condescension at all, what she was calculating. She had told him. He had held the other end of the tape without being asked and waited while she wrote the number in her notebook. He had not made it strange. He had simply helped and then said good afternoon and walked on. The third time was in the portrait gallery, where Sofia had gone to check the placement of the floral arrangements along the wall. The Duke had been standing alone in front of a large painting of an older woman, and he had not heard her come in. She had turned to leave quietly, and he had spoken without turning around, saying that the woman in the portrait was his grandmother, and that she had never approved of flowers indoors, but that he thought she would have made an exception for a wedding. Sofia had stayed, and they had talked for perhaps 20 minutes about nothing of particular importance. His grandmother, the portrait painter's technique, whether the arrangement of white roses she had chosen for the gallery would hold through a full day without wilting in the light from the high windows. He had remembered at the end of that conversation to ask her if she needed anything further for the arrangements. She had said no. The fourth time was the day she delivered the revised seating chart to Mr. Fitch and passed the Duke in the entrance hall. He had nodded at her. She had nodded back. That was all. 4 meetings, none of them significant, none of them anything more than the ordinary contact between a wedding coordinator and the head of the household she was working for. She had thought about all 4 of them more times than was reasonable. Standing now in the lane behind the estate wall, with the sound of carriage wheels on the street beyond, and the distant, muffled sound of the chapel organ beginning to play, Sofia pressed one hand flat against the cold stone and breathed. Victoria was inside. The Duke was inside. Every candle and flower and folded program and carefully measured chair was inside, and Sofia had put all of it there, and now she was outside with a leather case and a locked door, and the full, settled weight of understanding exactly how completely she had been removed from the picture. The organ grew louder. The ceremony was beginning. Sofia walked back to the main street. She did not go home. She sat inside her hired carriage at the edge of the road, directly across from the estate entrance, with the leather case on her lap and her eyes on the gate. She told the driver to wait. He gave her a look that suggested he had better things to do with a Wednesday morning, but said nothing and climbed back onto his seat. Guests were still arriving, though the stream had thinned considerably. The ceremony had begun. Sofia could hear the organ through the estate walls, low and steady, the kind of music that fills a space and makes everyone inside feel that something important is happening. She watched the gate. She was not entirely sure what she was waiting for. She only knew that she was not ready to turn the carriage around and go back to Thornfield House and sit in her parlor and pretend that this morning had not happened. That was not something she was capable of doing yet. A woman appeared at the gate from the inside. Sofia sat forward. The woman was not a guest. She was dressed in the dark, practical clothing of a senior household servant, and she moved with the kind of authority that came from years of managing large houses. She spoke briefly to the guards, and then stepped through the gate and looked up and down the street with sharp, searching eyes. It was Mrs. Garland. Sofia opened the carriage door before she had made a conscious decision to do so. She crossed the street quickly and called the housekeeper's name. Mrs. Garland turned. Her expression was complicated. There was something in it that looked very much like relief, followed immediately by something that looked like guilt, and then both of those things were replaced by the composed, neutral face of a woman who had spent 40 years managing difficult situations in difficult households. She said good morning to Sofia in a voice that gave nothing away. Sofia asked her directly why her name had been removed from the entry list. Mrs. Garland looked at the guards. She took 2 steps away from the gate and lowered her voice. She said that the instruction had come from above her authority. She said it had been given 3 days ago. She said she had not agreed with it, and had said so, and had been told that her opinion on the matter was not required. Sofia asked who had given the instruction. Mrs. Garland pressed her lips together. She looked toward the estate wall. Then she said one name, quietly, and without any additional comment. Lady Josephine Pembroke. Sofia stayed very still. Lady Josephine Pembroke was not the bride. She was not a member of the Blackwood family. She was a guest, a family connection on the Duke's mother's side, a woman who attended every significant social event in London, with the sort of focused presence that made people feel she was always watching for something specific. Sofia had met her twice during the planning process. Both times, Lady Josephine had appeared in rooms she had not been invited into, and asked questions she had no particular reason to ask. Once, she had picked up Sofia's notebook from the planning table and read through several pages before Sofia had quietly taken it back. Lady Josephine had smiled at her then, the kind of smile that was not warm at all, and said that Sofia was very organized for someone in her position. Sofia had not thought much of it at the time. She thought a great deal of it now. She asked Mrs. Garland why Lady Josephine Pembroke would have the authority to remove her name from the entry list. Mrs. Garland said that Lady Josephine had gone directly to the Duke's secretary, a young man named Mr. Crabbe, who was new to the household and eager to please people of rank, and had told him that Sofia Bowe had completed her engagement and was no longer required on the morning of the ceremony. She had said it with the confidence of someone delivering information rather than making a request, and Mr. Crabbe had simply done as he was told. Sofia absorbed this slowly. She asked Mrs. Garland whether the Duke knew. Mrs. Garland said she did not believe so. She said the Duke had been occupied with family arrivals since the previous evening, and that Mr. Fitch had been managing the morning's schedule entirely. She said Mr. Fitch had only discovered this morning that Sofia's name was missing from the list, and had been, in her words, considerably displeased. Sofia asked where Mr. Fitch was now. Inside, Mrs. Garland said, managing the ceremony. There was nothing he could do about it at this point without causing a disruption. Sofia looked at the estate wall. Behind it, the organ had shifted into something slower and more ceremonial. She recognized the piece. She had selected it herself 3 weeks ago, after spending an entire afternoon with the Duke's music director going through options. It was the processional, which meant Victoria was walking toward the altar at this exact moment. Walking toward Duke Henry Blackwood. Sofia asked Mrs. Garland one more question. She asked whether Victoria had known that she would be turned away this morning. Mrs. Garland was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that she could not speak to what Lady Victoria knew or did not know. She said it carefully, the way people say things when the honest answer would cause damage they are not prepared to be responsible for. That was answer enough. Sofia thanked her. She walked back to the carriage. She told the driver to take her home. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window and watched London move past her in the morning light, all its ordinary business, carrying on completely indifferent to the fact that her entire understanding of the last 2 months had just been rearranged into something she barely recognized. Lady Josephine Pembroke had removed her from the gate deliberately. Victoria had said nothing, and somewhere inside that estate, a wedding was completing itself without her, using every detail she had placed with her own hands. She opened her leather case and looked at the final ceremony program. Her handwriting was on the inside margin, small notes to herself about timing and positioning. She closed the case again. When the carriage stopped outside Thornfield House, she sat for a moment longer than necessary. Then she got out, paid the driver, and went inside. She had barely removed her coat when the knock came at the door. The man at the door was not someone Sofia had expected to see. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of face that suggested he spent more time outdoors than most men of his class. He was dressed well, but without ceremony, and he held his hat in both hands, with the slightly impatient energy of someone who had been moving quickly all morning. His name was Mr. Theodore Ames, and he was the Duke of Harwell's younger brother. Sophia had not met him during the planning process. She had seen his name on the guest list and had allocated him a seat in the third row of the chapel, close to the aisle, as he had apparently requested through Mr. Fitch. She had not given him further thought. He introduced himself and asked if he might come in. She showed him to the sitting room and remained standing, because she was not in the mood to make this a comfortable visit for anyone. He sat down without being invited to, and placed his hat on his knee, and looked at her with the kind of directness that was either very rude or very honest, depending on the person. He said he had left the ceremony. Sophia said nothing. He said he had left because he could not sit in that chapel and watch what was happening without doing something, and the only thing he could think to do was come here. She asked him what exactly he thought was happening. He said that his brother did not love Victoria Ashford. He said it plainly, without any dramatic presentation, as though it were a simple fact he was tired of carrying around. Sophia looked at him carefully. He continued. He said that the arrangement between Henry and Victoria had been managed almost entirely by Lady Josephine Pembroke, who was Victoria's maternal aunt, and a woman who had been trying to place her niece into the Blackwood family for the better part of 4 years. He said that Henry had agreed to the match 6 months ago, during a period when he had been under considerable pressure from various family expectations, and had not been thinking clearly about what he actually wanted. Sophia sat down now, not because she was comfortable, but because her legs had decided the conversation required it. She asked Theodore why he was telling her this. He looked at her steadily and said that he had watched his brother during the planning period. He said Henry was not a man who showed things easily or often, but that there had been something different about him during those 2 months. Something that Theodore, who had known his brother his entire life, had noticed and said nothing about, because it was not his place to say anything. Until now, apparently. Sophia told him to be very careful about what he said next. Theodore said he was always careful. He said he had come because the ceremony was not yet finished. He said the vows had not been exchanged when he left. He said there had been a delay because the Duke had stopped the procession. Sophia stood up again. Theodore said it quietly. He said Henry had raised his hand and stopped the music when Victoria was halfway down the aisle. He said the entire chapel had gone completely silent. He said Victoria had stopped walking and looked at Henry, and Henry had looked back at her, with an expression that Theodore described as a man who has finally stopped pretending something is true when it is not. Then Theodore said that Henry had turned to Mr. Fitch, standing at the side of the chapel, and asked where Sofia Bowe was. The room was very quiet. Sophia looked at the window. Outside, a cart was moving slowly down the street. A child was calling to someone across the road. Everything was completely ordinary. She asked Theodore what had happened after that. He said Mr. Fitch had told the Duke that Sophia had been turned away at the gate that morning, on the instruction of Lady Josephine Pembroke. He said Henry's face had changed in a way that Theodore had never seen before. He said Lady Josephine, seated in the front row, had stood up at that point and begun speaking very rapidly about propriety and the inappropriateness of the delay and the obligations of the Blackwood name. Henry had not looked at her once. He had looked at Victoria instead and said, very quietly, that he owed her an honest conversation before either of them took another step. He had said it with the kind of respect that was more serious than any declaration of love, and Victoria had looked at him for a long moment with an expression Theodore could not fully read, and then she had nodded once. The chapel had erupted at that point. Lady Josephine's voice had risen above everything. Several older guests had begun speaking at once. Lady Georgiana, seated near the back, had reportedly fainted, though Theodore suspected that was more theatrical than medical. And in the middle of all of it, Henry had walked out of the chapel. Sofia asked where he had gone. Theodore said he did not know. He said he had come here immediately after Henry left, because this was the only place he could think of where something true might actually be said. Sofia pressed her hand against the back of the chair she was standing beside. She thought about the garden and the measuring tape, and the Duke holding the other end of it without being asked. She thought about everything. Sofia picked up her coat from the chair where she had placed it, not 20 minutes ago. Theodore watched her. She told him she needed the carriage. He stood immediately and said it was waiting outside. He had not assumed she would come, but he had brought it just in case, because he was, he said, an optimistic person by nature. Sofia looked at him. Under any other circumstances, she might have found that funny. She put on her coat and picked up the leather case, which was still sitting by the door where she had dropped it when she came in. She did not know why she picked it up, force of habit perhaps, or because it contained 2 months of work and she was not yet ready to put it down. She walked out of Thornfield House and got into the carriage. Theodore climbed up beside the driver without being asked and said nothing further, which was exactly the right thing to do. The carriage moved into the street and turned back toward the estate, and Sofia sat with the leather case on her lap and the morning light coming through the window and the full, unsteady weight of not knowing at all what she was going to find when she got there. The estate gates were open when the carriage arrived, not the controlled, managed open of a ceremonial morning, with guards standing at attention and footmen directing arrivals. They were open the way gates are open when something has gone wrong inside and nobody has thought to close them yet. One of the younger guards was speaking rapidly to a footman near the wall. 3 carriages were pulled to the side of the drive in no particular order. A woman Sofia did not recognize was standing near the entrance with both hands pressed to her mouth. Sofia stepped down from the carriage before it had fully stopped. Theodore caught her arm briefly and said to wait. She removed her arm and walked through the gate. The courtyard was scattered with people who had clearly come outside from the chapel and did not know what to do with themselves now that they were there. She recognized faces from the guest list. Lord Pemberton, a heavy-set man with impressive side whiskers, was standing near the fountain, speaking in low, urgent tones to another gentleman. Lady Georgiana was seated on a stone bench with a young woman fanning her, apparently recovered from whatever had overtaken her inside the chapel. 2 elderly women were walking in tight circles near the chapel door, speaking over each other, without either one listening. Nobody stopped Sofia. She walked straight toward the chapel. Mr. Fitch appeared at the chapel door before she reached it. He was a compact, precise man who prided himself on never looking rattled, and he looked thoroughly rattled. When he saw Sofia, he closed his eyes briefly in what appeared to be genuine relief, then opened them and came toward her with quick, deliberate steps. He said he was very sorry about the morning. He said it without any qualification or deflection, which told her how seriously he meant it. He said Lady Josephine's interference had been completely outside the boundaries of anything he had authorized, and that he had already told the Duke as much. Sofia asked where the Duke was. Mr. Fitch said he was inside the chapel. He said Victoria was also still inside. He said the 2 of them had been speaking privately for the last 40 minutes, and that he had kept everyone else out by standing at the door himself, which had not made him particularly popular with the assembled guests. Sofia asked if she should go in. Mr. Fitch looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside. She pushed open the chapel door. The space was empty of guests, but full of everything she had arranged. The white roses along the gallery walls were still fresh, their petals completely open in the morning warmth. The candles were lit along every row. The programs she had written were folded neatly on each seat. The arch at the altar was exactly as she had designed it. Curved branches wound through with small white flowers and trailing green, and it was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, because she had made it beautiful for a wedding she had not known was her closest friends. Victoria was sitting in the front pew. The Duke was standing near the altar, not at it, slightly to the side, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his shoulders carrying the particular tension of a man who has been standing in one place, thinking very hard for a long time. Neither of them had heard her come in. Victoria saw her first. She stood up immediately, and in her face was something that Sofia had not expected. What was in Victoria's face was grief, raw and unmanaged, the face of someone who had been holding something painful for a very long time and had finally stopped being able to hold it. She said Sofia's name. The Duke turned. He looked at her the way people look at something they had stopped believing they would see. He did not move immediately. He simply looked, and his expression was so unguarded and so completely honest that Sofia had to look away from it for a moment, because it was too much to take in all at once. Victoria crossed the chapel toward her. She stopped 2 feet away and said that she owed her the truth and that she had owed it to her for months and had been too afraid to speak it. Sofia waited. Victoria said that Lady Josephine had come to her family 8 months ago with the arrangement. She said her family had accepted without consulting her, because the Ashford name had been struggling under pressures that Victoria had not been permitted to discuss, even with her closest friend. She said she had been told the match was settled, and that her feelings on the matter were secondary to the family's situation. Sofia said nothing yet. Victoria said she had agreed. She said she had agreed because she did not see another way, and because she had told herself that Henry Blackwood was a decent man, and that decency was enough to build a life on. She said she had not told Sofia because she knew. She had known for months with the certainty of someone who knows their oldest friend better than they know themselves, that Sofia had feelings for the Duke that Sofia had never once permitted herself to examine out loud. The chapel was completely silent. Victoria said that knowing that, and saying nothing, and allowing Sofia to plan the wedding without telling her the truth, was the worst thing she had ever done to another person. She said it without any attempt to make herself look better. She said it, and then she pressed her lips together and waited for whatever came next. Sofia stood with the leather case in her hand and looked at her oldest friend and felt the full, complicated weight of 11 years pressing down on this single moment. She asked Victoria one question. She asked whether Victoria loved the Duke. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said no. She said she respected him. She said he had been kind to her throughout the entire arrangement and had never once been unkind or cold or dismissive. But she said that love was not the word for what she felt, and that she had understood this morning, standing halfway down the aisle with the processional playing and the entire chapel watching, that respect and kindness were not enough reasons to stand at an altar. She said Henry had understood it too. Sofia looked at the Duke. He had not moved from where he was standing. He was watching her with the same expression he had worn when she first came through the door, open and still and completely without pretense. She asked him directly why he had stopped the ceremony. He said because it was wrong to continue it. He said he had known for some time that it was wrong, and had told himself that an obligation entered into honestly must be honored, regardless of what developed afterward. He said he had sat in that chapel this morning and listened to the processional begin, and thought about the woman who had chosen that music, and had understood in that moment that he could not do it. He said her name had come to him before anything else. The candles along the rows flickered in a draught from somewhere above, and the white roses held perfectly still, and Sofia stood in the middle of the chapel she had designed, and felt something shift inside her that had been locked in one position for a very long time. Lady Josephine Pembroke walked through the chapel door. She did not knock, she did not hesitate. She came in with the full momentum of a woman who had decided that enough time had been wasted and that she was the only person present capable of restoring order to the situation. She was still in her ceremonial clothes, a severe and expensive outfit in deep gold, and her face was set with the particular fury of someone whose careful plan had been publicly dismantled. She looked at Sofia first, then at the Duke, then at Victoria. She said this had gone on long enough. She said the guests were waiting. She said that whatever sentimental disruption had overtaken the morning, the practical reality was that an arrangement had been made, announcements had been sent to every significant household in London, and the Blackwood name could not afford the damage of a cancelled ceremony. She said it directly to the Duke, as though Sofia and Victoria were not in the room. Henry looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, that she had removed Sofia Bowe from the entry list without his knowledge or authorization. Lady Josephine said that had been a practical decision made in the interest of the morning running smoothly. Henry said that it was not her household and not her decision, and that she had used his secretary's inexperience to circumvent his staff without his knowledge, and that he would like her to leave the chapel immediately. Lady Josephine's expression shifted. She looked at Victoria and said that Victoria's family would not accept this. She said the Ashford name had entered this arrangement in good faith, and that Victoria deserved better than to be humiliated in front of all of London, because a wedding coordinator had turned the Duke's head. Victoria spoke before anyone else could. She said, clearly and without any trembling in her voice, that she released Henry from the arrangement entirely, and that she did so of her own will, and without any reservation. She said she wished him well. She said she wished Sofia well. She said she was going home. Then she looked at Lady Josephine and said that she would be speaking to her mother about the manner in which this arrangement had been made, and that certain things which had been kept from her family would not remain kept for very much longer. Lady Josephine opened her mouth. Victoria walked past her and out of the chapel door without looking back. The door closed behind Victoria, and the chapel was quiet again. Lady Josephine stood near the entrance with her composure partially intact, and her eyes moving between Sofia and the Duke, with the calculating stillness of someone deciding which direction to move in next. She was not a woman who accepted the end of things easily. Sofia could see that clearly. She had the look of someone already rearranging pieces in her head, already forming the next sentence that would put her back in a position of influence. Henry spoke before she could find it. He told her that Mr. Fitch was outside and would arrange her carriage. He said it with perfect courtesy and absolute finality, the tone of a man who was done with the conversation and was simply waiting for the other person to realize it. Lady Josephine looked at Sofia with an expression that was not quite a threat, but was not far from one. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked out of the chapel with the rigid dignity of a woman who intended to make someone pay for this later, though she had not yet decided who. The door closed again. Henry turned to Sofia. Neither of them spoke immediately. Sofia set the leather case down on the nearest pew. She had been carrying it all morning, and her arm was tired, and there was no longer any reason to hold it. Henry looked at the case, and then at her, and said that she had come back. She said she had unfinished business. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. She looked around the chapel. The flowers were still perfect. The candles were still burning. The programs were still folded on every seat. She had built this space for a wedding, and the wedding had not happened, and yet everything she had placed here with her own hands was still standing exactly where she had put it, holding its position with complete indifference to the morning's events. She told him that the roses in the gallery would begin to drop petals by early afternoon if the temperature in the chapel continued to rise. She said the string quartet had almost certainly left already, since they had been scheduled only through the ceremony. She said the wedding breakfast in the east dining room would need to be either served to the remaining guests or dismissed entirely, and that Mr. Fitch would need to make that decision quickly before the kitchen staff lost their timing. Henry listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said her name, not Miss Bowe, her name, Sofia. She stopped talking about the roses. He said that he had thought about the garden many times. The afternoon with the measuring tape. He said it had been an unremarkable thing, holding the end of a tape while someone wrote a number in a notebook, and yet he had thought about it more times than he could reasonably justify to himself. She said she had thought about the portrait gallery. He looked at her steadily. He said he had been in that gallery on purpose. He said he had seen her go in from the corridor window and had followed her in without any plan, which was not something he did often, because he was generally a man with a plan for everything. Sofia looked at the altar, at the arch she had built, at the trailing green wound through with white flowers that she had selected from a catalogue on a rainy afternoon, holding each option up to the window to see how it caught the light. She said that she had planned every detail of this wedding without knowing it was Victoria's. She said she had done it professionally and carefully and with genuine pride in the work. But she said that somewhere in the middle of it, in the garden and the portrait gallery, and the 20 unremarkable minutes of conversation about roses and painters and grandmothers, something else had been happening that she had refused to name, because naming it would have made it impossible to continue behaving sensibly. Henry crossed the chapel toward her. He stopped at a respectful distance, and he looked at her with the same expression he had worn when she came through the door, open and unguarded and entirely honest. He said he was aware that the morning had been one of the more chaotic in recent memory. He said he was aware that he had just stopped his own wedding in front of every significant family in London, and that the social consequences of that would be considerable and would occupy him for some time. He said he was aware that what he was about to say was probably not what a reasonable person would say at the end of a morning like this one. Sofia said she had not had a reasonable morning either, and that he should go ahead. He said that he would very much like to begin again, not from the garden or the portrait gallery or the corridor introduction arranged by Mr. Fitch, from here, from this moment, with full honesty and no arrangements managed by anyone else on either of their behalf. Outside the chapel, the sounds of the courtyard had shifted. The urgent murmuring of confused guests had given way to something calmer. Carriages were beginning to move. The morning was reorganizing itself into something quieter and less dramatic, the way mornings always did eventually, regardless of what had happened in them. Mr. Fitch appeared briefly at the chapel window, looked in, saw the situation, and disappeared again with the practiced discretion of a man who had managed difficult households for 30 years and knew precisely when not to intervene. Theodore Ames was visible for a moment in the courtyard beyond, speaking to Lord Pemberton with the relaxed ease of someone who had expected the morning to go exactly this way, and was not at all surprised by how it had turned out. Lord Pemberton did not look equally relaxed, but that was his general condition. Lady Georgiana had recovered fully from her episode on the bench, and was now standing near the fountain, speaking at considerable speed to two other women, her hands moving expressively. Whatever version of the morning's events she was telling, it appeared to be a very good story. Sofia looked at all of this through the chapel window, and then looked back at Henry. She said she had 2 conditions. He said he was listening. She said the first condition was that Mr. Crabbe, the secretary who had removed her name from the entry list without question, was to receive a very thorough lesson in whose instructions he was actually authorized to follow. Henry said that had already been addressed. She said the second condition was that any future arrangements of any kind went through her directly. No solicitors, no intermediaries, no letters from households that did not specify what they were actually asking her to do. Henry looked at her for a moment. Then he said that was entirely fair, and that he agreed to both conditions without reservation. Sofia picked up the leather case from the pew. She opened it and took out the final ceremony program, the one with her small handwritten notes in the margin. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed it back inside and closed the case. She told Henry that the wedding breakfast in the East dining room was going to go to waste if someone did not make a decision about it in the next 20 minutes. He said that was probably true. She said that it seemed a considerable shame to waste a breakfast that had taken 3 days to plan. He said it did seem a shame. She said that the dining room seated 40 comfortably, but was perfectly pleasant with fewer people, and that if the remaining guests who were still in the courtyard were invited in, it would at least give the morning a reasonable ending. Henry said that was an excellent idea, and asked if she would join them. She said yes. They walked out of the chapel together into the courtyard, where the morning light was full and clear, and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened inside, and where Theodore Ames, upon seeing them, said nothing at all but smiled. Mr. Fitch materialized beside Henry with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been waiting just off to the side for exactly this outcome. He said the dining room was ready. He said the kitchen staff had held everything at temperature. He said the flowers on the breakfast table were the same arrangement Sofia had selected, pale yellow and white, and that they were holding up very well. Sofia told him they would need settings for however many guests remained. Mr. Fitch said he had already counted and had instructed the staff accordingly. She looked at him. He said, with great composure, that he had been in this profession for 30 years and that one learned to anticipate. The guests who remained filtered into the East dining room in small groups, still talking in low voices, still piecing together exactly what they had witnessed that morning and what it meant. Lord Pemberton sat at the far end of the table and looked at his plate with the expression of a man who intended to eat well, regardless of the social drama surrounding him, which Sofia thought was probably the most sensible approach anyone had taken all morning. Lady Georgiana arrived last and seated herself directly in the middle of everything, and immediately began speaking again, which meant the story of the morning was going to be everywhere in London by nightfall, regardless of what anyone did about it. Victoria Ashford had gone home. Sofia thought about her during breakfast. She would go to see Victoria, not today, but soon, because 11 years did not simply stop, and because the honest conversation Victoria had given her in that chapel, the one she had been afraid to have for months, was not nothing. It was not enough to undo the hurt of the morning, but it was not nothing. Henry was seated beside her at the table. He was speaking to the gentleman on his left about something entirely unrelated to the events of the day, with the composed manner of a man who had made a significant decision and had no intention of second-guessing it. Occasionally he turned toward Sofia with a look that was quiet and certain and completely without performance. She looked back each time. Outside the dining room windows, London was moving through its Wednesday with complete indifference. Carts and carriages and people with ordinary business going about it. The street did not know that inside this house a wedding had stopped and a breakfast had continued, and two people were sitting beside each other at a table full of flowers and food, and guests still buzzing with the shock of the morning. The leather case was beside Sofia's chair. At some point during the breakfast, Mr. Fitch leaned down and said quietly that whenever she was ready, he would take the final documents from her and file them appropriately. She handed him the case. He took it with both hands and inclined his head and carried it away with the careful attention of a man who understood that what was inside it represented a great deal of work and deserved to be treated accordingly. Sofia watched him go and then looked back at the table, at the pale yellow flowers and the good food, and the morning light coming through the tall windows, and the improbable, unplanned, entirely real shape of what the day had turned into. Henry said her name quietly beside her. She turned. He said nothing further. He simply looked at her the way he had looked at her in the garden, with the measuring tape, and in the portrait gallery with the roses, and in the chapel when she had come through the door. Completely open, completely honest. She held his gaze and did not look away.